Good afternoon. You're in for a treat. Ed Glaeser is coming to speak with us and to us about the genius of cities. For more than 2 decades, Ed has been the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he has taught generations of students microeconomic theory and urban and public economics. Dr. Glaeser is a prolific scholar. He's published reams of important papers on cities, especially the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of idea transmissions. His most recent book, The Triumph of the City, was reviewed widely in academic journals and popular press and so forth. And let me read to you what The Economist had to say. Glaeser calls cities our species' greatest invention, noting that proximity makes people more inventive, more productive, and kinder to the planet. He builds a strong case, too, for town dwelling, dwelling on his own research as well as that of other observers of urban life. And here's the thing. Although liberally sprinkled with statistics, Triumph of the City is no dry work. Mr. Glaeser writes lucidly and spares his readers the equations of his trade. I want to tell you a little bit about Ed Glaeser. He grew up in New York City, and he loves cities. In fact, he loves cities so much that last year, he took his 3 children out of school, I bet the children were happy, and took them on a 5-month trip to 5 cities around the world and lived a month in each one of those cities. And one of those months was spent right here in Barcelona. In fact, when he told his 7-year-old son he was coming back, his 7-year-old son said, "Hey, Dad, make sure you say hello to Bobo, the monkey in the zoo." Now, some years before Dr. Glaeser wrote Triumph of the City, another author foreshadowed his work. E.B. White, author of Charlotte's Web and other stories that you may or may not know, wrote more than 60 years ago, and he wrote about New York City. He said, "The city is like poetry. It compresses life, all races and all breeds. At the feet of the tallest and plushest offices lie the crummiest slums. It is a miracle that New York works at all. The whole thing is implausible. Every time residents brush their teeth, millions of gallons of water must be drawn from the mountains. The subterranean system of telephone cables, power lines, steam pipes, gas mains, and sewer pipes is reason enough to abandon the island to the gods and the weevils. New York not only provides continuing excitation, but is also a spectacle that is continuing. I wander around examining this spectacle, hoping that I can put it on paper." Well, 60 years later, we have another author who loves cities, who has put it on paper, and I want you to hear what he's had to say. Ed Glaeser.
Thank you. Thank you for those enormously kind words, and thank you for giving me this time in the midst of this enormously cool place, filled with all of these tremendous innovations that are out there to make city life better. I'm just incredibly excited to be here and very grateful to be part of the program. But I want to start with a question. Let's see, where's the thing from the thing? We need to actually have some technology here. I can see it down here, but I need it up here. Well, if you were seeing the picture that's on the slide deck, I would be asking you, do you think any of these technologies will ever do as much as the aqueduct did to make city life livable? So I have a picture of the Segovia Aqueduct, which I'm looking at, but you're not. The aqueduct is important, right, because it reminds us that many of the most important technologies are not brilliant pieces of electronics. They are ordinary pieces of rock. They're an idea that matters not because it serves purely as a technical marvel, but because it actually makes life better. And that is, after all, the whole point of smart cities of this technology. Its value is not about how cool the technology is. Its value is to what extent does it defeat one of the demons that come with density. For indeed, one of the key points of this talk is that cities are marked by miraculous things, by these collaborative chains of creativity that have powered humanity's greatest hits, from Athenian philosophy to Facebook. But there are also demons that come with density. There are also downsides to being near one another, right? There's traffic congestion, there's crime, and perhaps worst of all, there's contagious disease. Two people are close enough to give each other an idea face to face, they're also close enough to pass something on. And the reason why pass on a disease, pass on a bacteria, and the reason why the aqueduct matters is because it saves lives and makes city growth feasible. Now, when we think about technology in the city in the future, there's a dance between technology and urban life. And in some sense, technologies can be thought of as having two broad types, one of which are urbanizing, centripetal, as we would say in English, bringing together, bringing towards the center. I think the Spanish word is centrifugal, right? On the other hand, there are other technologies which are centrifugal, pulling people apart. I think that's centrifugal, I think is the Spanish version. And the question of whether or not cities are moving forward or spreading out or dispersing is a question of whether or not centripetal or centrifugal forces are ascendant in the technology. Now, at the time of those aqueducts, at the great era of Western civilization, that was an era of great centripetal technologies. The aqueduct, the roads, all of the things that happened in Western civilization with those first cities, like Barcelona, of course, a great city of the West. And then we had a great burst of centrifugal de-urbanizing technology, like the Huns, right? So this is a centrifugal technology here, right? We have this spread out of population from the cities that responds to fear from violence. You know, in some sense, the technology is the bow, the technology is the horse, but it causes a great de-urbanization of Europe. Now, I feel at this point in time that I have to actually respond, because the Huns remind us of it, to the events in Paris last Friday. We have been living under the shadow of terror in cities for decades now. And we ask this question, as we must now ask in response to the events of Friday, right, whether or not terrorism will cause Paris to stumble, Paris to disperse, or more generally for cities to falter. This was exactly the question that we asked after the 9/11 attacks. And I think when I looked at the problem then, I sort of saw two opposing forces, one of which is cities are targets, as the World Trade Center is a target, and they will continue to be targets, right? They're exactly what someone who's trying to make a point wants to attack. But cities can also be safe enclaves. They can be fortresses. And the other picture is a picture of the cameras which dotted London during the terrorist attacks of the 1980s, right? Cities can be made safe in a way that wide dispersed areas cannot. But I think there's a larger point, as I think about this 10 years later, when I think about terrorism in urban form, that fighting terrorism is not just about police work. It's not just about cameras. It's about solving the underlying problems that cause it. It's about making the banlieues of Paris places of opportunity and hope, as well as desperation. And when I think about creating opportunity in the banlieues, about where the ideas are going to come from to actually uplift these areas, that's going to be urban. Because, in fact, over centuries, over millennia, cities have had a remarkable ability to solve their own problems. And we don't know how to fix the banlieues right now, but I believe we can and we will. But those solutions will come out of cities. Now, after the Huns came in, this is a return back to European history, we started having an urban resurgence again 1,000 years ago. And there were two technologies that particularly mattered. This is, of course, proto-Barcelona, right, the old city, the ship and the wall. These are both traditional technologies that bring us together, that connect us with one another. And the shipping, right, reminds us that cities and globalization are linked. Right? And the more globalized the world, cities are places which are pathways across oceans and continents, as they continue to be. Now, one of the things that was really puzzling, really interesting that happened in the great cities of the Western Renaissance is that we had this outflowing of new technologies that didn't just change cities, they came from cities. Now, for example, one of the ways in which the power of cities to spread ideas is really obvious is in pictures, in art. So think about Renaissance Florence. A city that was built on wool and banking, right, a very traditional city, but one in which a chain of brilliance manages to do absolutely miraculous things. So Brunelleschi figures out the basic mathematics of linear perspective, making two-dimensional spaces seem three-dimensional. He passes it along to Donatello, who puts it in low-relief sculpture on the wall of Orson Michele, right? Donatello passes it along to Masaccio, who puts it in painting. You know, Brancacci Chapel, St. Peter finding a silver coin in the belly of a fish. He passes along to Fra Filippo Lippi, that less than saintly monk, right? Passes along to Botticelli and so forth. Each person riffing on each other's idea. Each person knew each other, borrowed each other's ideas, and worked, competitively and collaboratively to do something magical. The same process led to this even more miraculous thing of the printing press with movable type, right? Gutenberg, again, a collaborative urban invention. And one might have thought, when one first thinks about this most important piece of information technology ever, right, the printing press, that it would have been a great de-urbanizing force, a great centrifugal force. For after all, now that we can communicate by printed word, why should we possibly live together in the same city? But that's not at all what happened. The work of Jeremiah Dittmer confirms statistically what we all should have known. The printing press was not de-urbanizing, it was urbanizing. It brought together people in cities. It created a more urban Europe because it created a more information-intensive Europe, a more idea-intensive Europe, a more connected Europe, a more commercial Europe. And it makes a larger point, which is face-to-face communications are not substituted for by communications on paper. They're complements with one another. They go together. The ability to read complements the ability to talk. The two things go together. Now, over the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, cities were dominated by the centripetal technologies, right? Above all, cities were growing as places of global trade, right? We see this both in Venice, right? The traditional bridge between East and West, the connector between the Ottoman Empire and the kingdoms of Europe. And we see this in Mumbai, right? There you see just growing up as a small port. Today, a massive megacity, but still playing a role as being a connector across space. Globalization and cities go together, then as now. And what happened as we developed steam engines is you moved from cities merely as places of commerce to places of industry. What you're looking at here is the stockyards of Chicago, right, which were part of the process of transporting corn and wheat from the rich fields of Iowa, then transformed into cows or pigs. The cows were slaughtered in the stockyards. They were frozen in the refrigerated rail cars by armor and shipped to the east. Industry clustering around the central transportation hub. Mobility making cities. Along with this was another centripetal technology, the ability to move up. Now, skyscrapers, right, are actually a combination of two technologies that already existed. Right? A skyscraper being a tall building with a load-bearing steel or cast iron skeleton. The first of these technologies is actually the steel frame. This is the Crystal Palace in London, one of the early examples of having a steel frame building, long before the skyscraper, and actually it comes out of a gardener. A gardener comes up with this idea. The combination of the steel frame has to come together with the elevator, and this is Elisha Otis who patents the safety elevator, decades before the skyscraper comes about. And then finally you have it, right? Home Insurance Building of Chicago, the first skyscraper, right? But is it really? It's not, actually, and the architects highly debate this issue, because the Home Insurance Building only has two walls with a load-bearing steel skeleton. The back two walls are traditional masonry walls, right? And so there's a lively debate among architectural historians. Does its architect, William Baron Jenney, deserve the title, the father of the skyscraper, or should that title instead be given to Louis Sullivan, or Daniel Burnham, or Adler, or Root, or the great fireproofing engineer Peter B. White? Well, I submit to you that any of these attempts to isolate the first skyscraper or the father of the skyscraper is a fool's errand. Because the skyscraper, like pretty much everything else our species has done that's worth anything, is a collaborative innovation. It's not an innovation of one person. It's an invention of Chicago, of collective genius, all of whom knew each other, right? Both Burnham and Sullivan were apprentices in Jenney's office. And it was together, collectively, that they made this thing, that they made the skyscraper. Now, moving beyond the centripetal forces of the 19th century, we now start to look at something that's both centripetal and centrifugal, which is public transportation. And the first step on public transportation is the horse-drawn omnibus, right? Pioneered, of course, by the great philosopher Blaise Pascal in 17th century Paris, but he didn't have enough scale to get that to work, so it starts taking off in the early 19th century. And then morphs into streetcars and elevated railroads, and cities start sprawling. And of course, that's what the CERTA plan is for Barcelona. As the city sprawls out of its walls, right, it shows us 19th century sprawl. But of course, the reason why it doesn't feel like 20th century sprawl is you still have to build on a walking scale, on a human scale, and that's what makes these neighborhoods still so delightful and so fundamentally different from the great 20th century transportation technology. Now, that 20th century technology, of course, was also the fruit of the cities. And, it's about this person, Henry Ford, right, who's associated with it, but just as Jenny isn't the sole parent of the skyscraper, Ford is not the sole parent of the car, not even the sole parent of the cheap car in America, right? He was part of a cluster of genius in Detroit. It's about the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar Buick, Ransom E. Olds, Billy Durant, right? A series of guys, all of whom knew each other, all of whom supplied each other with parts, with financing, and with ideas. That's what cities do that matters. And that's how cities are creators of technology as well as creations of technology. Now, the problem was that Ford's big idea was this, right? Was the River Rouge. And this vast factory was fundamentally non-urban. Right? If you think about successful cities at the start of the 19th century, they have the same three features as successful cities at the start of the 21st century. Small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. How far from that is a vast vertically integrated factory like the Rouge? And when cost conditions change, right, you just move these factories somewhere else. On top of that, of course, Ford's cars, which were enormously valuable in the short run, ended up being enormously damaging for cities in the long run. They are the ultimate example of a centrifugal technology, of one that disperses, right? Both because they allow you to travel long distances and because they're point-to-point. They don't involve any walking. You just drive to the parking lot and get out. It's not the same as a bus stop where you fundamentally have to walk. The work of Nathaniel Baum Snow at Brown finds that each new highway line that cut into an urban core after World War II reduced the central city's population by about 18%. Relative to the metropolitan area as a whole. And this move towards the car was the great event of the 20th century in the United States. And of course, it's not just about the United States. These are two examples of car-based sprawl. Neither of them are American. One of them is Canada, in Ontario, and this one, that's Paris, right? Sprawl is not just an American phenomenon, it's a ubiquitous phenomenon. This is the decline in the cost of moving a ton of mile by rail in the United States. So whereas in the 17th and 18th century, a globalized, connected world meant larger cities, what these declining transportation costs did was they enabled factories to move to lower-cost locations, first in suburbs, then in places with cheap labor, and then across the oceans entirely, right? The deindustrialization of our cities accompanied this suburbanization of population. Now, one way of seeing this is what happened because of the decline of transportation costs is that people were able to move from areas in which firms had a productive advantage to places where people had a desire to live. And apparently what we learn, if that's the way that we interpret it, is what people really wanted was a little bit less winter. Because in fact, in the US, there's no variable that better predicts 20th century population growth than January temperature. And that's what you're looking at here, right? This is the 1 is the coldest, the 5 is the warmest across America's metropolitan areas. This isn't just an American phenomenon. This is the exact same graph for the European Union, right? Warm areas have grown at the expense of cold areas. Now, the technologies that we have for cities, sometimes we screw this up, right? So hit by the decline in industry, hit in the suburbanization of population, the federal government tried a technological solution. It was essentially a Potemkin village solution of thinking that putting in some form of snazzy technology like a monorail would just on the basis of its magic alone cause Detroit to come back. Now, any logic about this tells you that this is a foolish thing to do, right? Detroit is easy to get around. Look at the streets underneath, they're empty. You can run a bus at any speed you want down the streets of Detroit, right? And yet, because of some idea of technological determinism, we put a monorail on top of it and say Detroit will come back. Technology is magical, it is important, but only when it is fit with the human needs of the city. This was my youth. It was mentioned that I was born in New York City. These are two iconic images from the New York of my childhood, where it seemed that not just President Ford, but history itself was telling New York to drop dead, right? Population had been dispersing, and indeed, it looked as if we were looking to a future of New York in which the weeds would come up and then reclaim the once proud towers, where the cities looked like they were dead. But that's not what happened, right? In fact, many of our cities, not all of them, Detroit is still troubled, but many of our cities, both in the US and in Europe, have had remarkable renaissances during my lifetime. In 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle, asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights. Because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. And it didn't come back because of old technologies. It came back because of new technologies, right? In 1971, there was no Amazon. There was no Microsoft. There was no Costco. There was no Starbucks. Well, maybe there was a little bit of coffee roasting going on. But all of these things, all of these new entrepreneurial activities brought Seattle back. Milan, right? An ancient city, Mediolanum, right? Milan comes back as a former industrial city redefined around both design and technology. This is the City Life Project. It's an artist's impression by Daniel Libeskind. And this is a way of seeing this, right? Over the past 10 years, the blue line shows the relationship between incomes and density. The red line shows the relationship between population growth and initial density. So cities are the absence of physical space between people. They are density, proximity, closeness. And what the graph shows is that the densest half of America's counties have incomes that are 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. And as you start with less land per capita, you have more population growth, both in the US and in Europe. So whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves to spread out, today the triumph is of centripetal technology. We're actually coming back together. We're clustering together. Now, it's not for every city. And what you're looking at here is the relationship between education and urban success. Measured by income, I could show you the same relationship with urban growth. If you want to understand why Seattle and Detroit look different, you don't have to look further than the fact that 1/2 of Seattle's adults have college degrees, 1/8 of Detroit's adults have college degrees. Human capital, education, is urban density. If cities succeed by enabling people to teach one another, the more skills they have coming in, the more successful cities are. Now, it's easy when you think about cities to somehow or other think that all this new information technology is really finally, I know you've got your book story, but now that we've got Facebook, we really don't need to ever meet at all, right? We can just share photos online. And that story's been around for a long time. The cyberseers and the techno-prophets were predicting that all this information technology was going to make face-to-face contact and the cities that enable that contact obsolete. That's not at all what happened, right? What happened was that instead of having a dispersing effect, it ended up having a combining effect. So one image of this is the Wallace office at Bloomberg City Hall in New York, which is modeled on the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, which is modeled on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Here's a funny thing, right? Here are some of the wealthiest people on the planet on a trading floor, who instead of enjoying large offices and dispersing, they're right on top of each other. Why? Because they know that knowledge is more important than space. And what globalization and new technologies have done is they've radically increased the returns to being smart. They've radically increased the returns to innovation, and that plays to cities' advantages, because cities are places where we get smart by being around other smart people. The more complicated the world is, the more valuable it is to be in the same room. Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your message, not knowing your material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. Right? And we have evolved for millions of years to have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another. That's why face-to-face contact is still so important and only becomes more important in a world of greater complexity. That's why Google, which of all the companies in the world should be able to enable long-distance work. Is that what they do? They say to everyone, go home, go work at home and just dial it in? Of course not. They build the Googleplex so everyone's on top of each other 24/7. They buy 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan. And Marissa Mayer at Yahoo doesn't say go home and work. She requires everyone to show up, because face-to-face contact is the life's blood of innovation. It's the life's blood of invention. Now, cities are not just about skills that are learned in schools. They're also about the skills that are learned on the city street. And there's no talent that is more important than the inclination to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz looked at New York and Pittsburgh and noted that New York was more entrepreneurial than Pittsburgh was even then. He argued that this was a result of an industrial history of the garment trade, which is a mother of entrepreneurship. It is remarkable, given how mediocre our measures of entrepreneurship are, that they do such a good job of predicting urban resilience. The ones are the places that have the most small, scrappy firms. The fives are the ones that have the biggest firms. Small firms, big growth. You don't want big smokestacks. You want small, nimble startups if your city is going to survive and change. Now, the most entrepreneurial place I've ever been is the Dharavi slum of Mumbai, a place that is just crammed with Indian talent, of people that just make you incredibly hopeful about the future of India. And then you go out and you see a child defecating in an unpaved road, and it reminds you of those demons that come with density. It reminds you of the desperate need for both technological and social solutions that actually can make cities safe for the children of Dharavi, which is actually the most important thing that we can possibly do. Now, We have a track record of this in the West, right? Cities were traditional killing fields. In 1900, a boy born in New York City could expect to live 7 years less than the national average. The same life expectancy gap was associated with living in Shakespeare's London, right? That didn't happen easily. We had to spend an enormous amount. America's cities and towns were spending as much on water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. But it's not just about spending on technology or infrastructure. The great highlight of New York's infrastructure was the Croton Aqueduct, right? Again, hearkening us back to 2,000 years ago. You see it, it's right there, it's 1842. It's right in the middle of cholera epidemics. If you look at the graph, it does nothing. And the reason for that is that it wasn't accompanied by social change. It wasn't accompanied by any legislation or any rules that made poor people actually move to adopting it. And so 25 years later, we still had cholera epidemics because poor people still used shallow wells and still used pit latrines in the middle of the street. That's exactly what we're facing today in Africa and the last mile problem. We build the water mains and we don't prod the poor people to connect. We don't create the subsidies needed to do so. Right? Until you have social legislation that matches the infrastructure, it doesn't work. The same thing is true in congestion. Right? We can't just build our way out of traffic congestion because of something that's called the fundamental law of highway traffic, as identified by the economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner. The fundamental law says vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. If you build more, they'll just drive more. Okay, and you won't get rid of traffic that way. That's one of the great promises of smart cities, is we can do better road pricing. This is Singapore with electronic road pricing, where the streets have moved fluidly for the past 30 years because we've actually done what economists have always said you need to do, which is to charge people, right, for the social cost of their actions. Not to give away city streets for free, but if people are creating pollution or people are creating congestion, you actually need to charge them for the cost of their actions. There's no free lunch here. You can't just give stuff away and expect people to treat it properly. Now, there are other technologies which are also centripetal, right? Zipcar, Airbnb, and the sharing economy. Well, there's nothing new about cities and the sharing economy. Cities have always been about sharing. What is an urban park but a shared backyard? What is an urban restaurant but a shared kitchen and a shared dining room? The difference is that what technology does is it makes it possible to share more things. So the reason why you couldn't have Zipcar in New York in 1975 is you'd go to Times Square and to pick up your car, and there'd be like a dead body in the trunk. And it'd be really bad because you didn't want to deal with a dead body, right? So what technology does, it means you know who had the car last, so you know who left the dead body in the trunk, so no dead bodies show up there. And that's what technology makes possible. Now, when cities are able to deal with the demons of density, to deal with these downsides, when they're able to deal with crime and traffic congestion, they can be places of incredible pleasure as well as productivity. Right? Connecting in cyberspace will never compare with sharing a meal or a kiss or a smile. And that's very much at the heart of what Barcelona is. And Barcelona's great comparative advantage is a place of so much pleasure, right, which just needs to be a place that attracts and empowers more entrepreneurs. A couple of final observations. One, the physical environment of cities is really important, and there are two dragons to watch out for. One is NIMBYism, saying no to everything, a particularly Anglo-Saxon vice that we've then transmuted to former colonies like Mumbai, a place that has labored under floor area ratios that kept the city low and sprawled it out instead of sprawling up. Right? When cities don't allow new building, they become expensive boutiques available only to the wealthy. You need to build if the city is going to become affordable. On the other hand, you need to build for humanity, not for monuments. Right? You need to actually build the spaces that are needed, not the spaces that simply look good to architects. So that's why monumentalism is the second zone. Problem number, penultimate point. Entrepreneurship is thriving in many of our cities. What's not fixed, what's not solved, is making that entrepreneurship more inclusive. What's not fixed is figuring out ways to create innovation districts, not just on shiny waterfronts for rich people, but also innovation that actually lifts up the poor. And the key answer here is the right answer is not just taking from the rich and giving to the poor. It's being smart about it. It's figuring out new programs to empower, to educate, to train, and to connect people who are coming out of poverty areas with businesses, with occupations. Cities are the only place where that can happen, and they are the future. One last point. One of the reasons to get cities right is that cities also have an environmental role. And I want to end this up with a story about a young Harvard College graduate who, at a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord, Massachusetts. He did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. But then he came to cook the fish into a soup. And as he cooked, the wind flicked the flames into a nearby dry grass. And a fire started, and it spread, and it spread. And by the time it was done, it was a raging inferno that had burned up more than 400 acres of prime woodland. In his own day, this young man was criticized, castigated, as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freeman called him a flibbertigibbet, which which I think was pretty bad for 1844. And indeed, I can't think of anyone who did as much damage to the environment at his age as he did. Of course, today, he is the secular saint of American environmentalism. His book, Walden, preaches a gospel of what a wonderful thing it is to live surrounded by nature. But I think about Thoreau's life, right? This secular saint's life, and I read a different lesson. The story of the forest fire reminds me we are a destructive species. And if you love nature, you should stay away from it. As indeed Thoreau would have done nature a great deal of good if he had stayed at home instead of cooking soups in the middle of the woods. Now, it turns out there's a statistical analog to this. If we look out across areas in the world, the places that look green are brown, the places that look brown are green. And the reason for this is that when people live in dense areas like Barcelona, they live in smaller housing units and they tend to take public transportation or drive shorter distances. When they live in woodsy areas, right, they tend to drive longer distances. They tend to use more carbon at home. And I found this out myself. When I started acquiring small children about 10 years ago, I moved from one of those green areas in there to one of those brown areas out there and started doing about as much damage to the environment as Thoreau did, what with the driving and the heating and everything. Now, I don't want to end on that. I think the last point to keep in mind is that climate change is difficult, inequality is difficult. These are important challenges and what technology is meant to be used for. But the track record of cities to work change is really miraculous. For thousands of years, unbelievable things have been happening in cities. And it's not just about technology, it's about society, it's about beliefs, it's about democracy, it's about freedom. And ultimately, the payoff from getting smart cities right is not just about the technology. It's about empowering a humanity that gets to be more free, gets to have greater opportunities, and gets to chart its own future. So thank you all for all of the work that you do to make cities more livable, and I'm so grateful that you gave me your time. I went over. Do we want to have a question or what? Where's management? Yeah. Does anyone want to ask a quick question? As no one seems to be pulling me off. Yes, sir.
How do you implement all this?
So it's not from the top down, I'll tell you that. The question was, how does democracy come with urbanization? How does one implement this? How does one make sure that the Arab Spring tilts towards democracy rather than tilts towards dictatorship? The answer is it's uneven, it's jolty, right? But there is no future in rural poverty. There is no force for democratic change that comes from the long-term, rural population. If you look about where democracy came from, it always comes from urban organization, urban unrest. And obviously, historically, when there's more education, those uprisings have tended to be more democratic, ultimately. But it's always a risky business. But it's a better business than living with dictatorship and death. Yes, sir.
Thank you. In America and other countries, we built an awful lot of suburban sprawl, car-dependent suburban sprawl. What do we do with all that? How do we put the genie back in the bottle?
Infrastructure changes very slowly, and it's not as if we're going to shut down America's suburbs overnight. Indeed, I would argue, in fact, that the point is not to dictate one particular type of life. I'm not a lifestyle consultant. I'm not telling any of you where you should live. The greatness of a city is that it's an archipelago of neighborhoods in which people have choices. You may prefer the Barrière Gothique, you may prefer, the Olympic Village. The glory of a country is it gives people who like living around woods the opportunity to live around them. What you need to do is charge people for the social cost of their actions, right? So you need to charge people appropriate carbon taxes. That means that if they choose an energy-intensive lifestyle, they're paying for the social cost of that. You need to make sure that if you're not going to subsidize people to drive long distances by using general tax revenues to pay for ever lengthier highways. So I don't think the right answer is to think that American suburbs are going to shut down. We don't see that. But I think it is a point that you need to have policies that create, at the very least, a level playing field that internalize the costs of people's actions. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. The question I've got is, I was here last year and this year the same. I walk around this expo and conference and very few people are talking about food. And I don't just mean about the refreshments during the breaks. But one of the reasons why we can live in cities is because we addressed that issue of being able to provide food for people not having to till the land themselves. And I wonder whether there's a danger in our approaches to smart cities that we begin to ignore that, and it doesn't ultimately address some of the fundamental problems that we have of, well, the demons of density, like you mentioned.
So, your point is exactly right. So one of the things that's really amazing on a macro scale is if you go back 50 years and ask yourself how many countries with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more than 1/3 urban, the answer is none, not a one, because historically to be poor was to be rural, right? The US didn't reach a 50% urbanization level until per capita incomes were $7,500. And the reason for that is you needed to grow your own food. You needed to transport that food, otherwise you couldn't support the cities. Today, 40% of the world's poorest countries are more than 1/3 urban. We've seen the growth of cities like Kinshasa, like Port-au-Prince, right, in places that are unbelievably poor. And part of the reason for that is they don't have to feed themselves, right? Port-au-Prince in Haiti can be fed by rice shipped out of New Orleans. A globalized world has made urbanization possible in the very poorest places. Now, there are both upsides and downsides to that. Because the more that the Congo or Haiti is connected to a global trading market, the less prone it is to ultimate disaster from having an ecological fiasco here at home. If they can trade with Siberia, they can get wheat that's grown there and have less risk of actually dying. So I think actually a global trading network is in some sense a security net. But the other flip side of that is we see megacities in places that are both poor and poorly governed to an extent that was never before imaginable in humanity's history. I think the right answer to that is not to try and shut this urban growth down, not to try and disperse it, but to devote all of our energies to trying to make these places more humane, partially in the hope that actually, with a larger Kinshasa, with a safer Kinshasa, it becomes a more democratic and a safer Congo as well, right? But this is the ultimate goal of smart cities. It's not about Barcelona, which is a fantastic city and will continue to be a fantastic city. It's about the payoff of technology for the poorest 75% of humanity, for which cities are their one hope. And in fact, they desperately need the talents that are in this room to actually make their living better. And that's actually the real magic and the real promise of what we're looking at, is that actually technology has the possibility, when combined with good governance, to actually make the poor world's megacities somewhat more humane, somewhat more of places of opportunity rather than places of misery. Okay, let me finish on that notice. Thank you all for your time.